my name is Katie and I'm a lecturer in the law school at Swansea University. I began working here in 2016 whilst I was still completing my PhD. I teach a property law core law module called Equity and Trust to students in their second year, and I'm also one of the LLB admissions tutors. So some of you may have already seen me at an open day if you've already visited us here at Swansea. My research interests are in the areas of counter-terrorism law and policy and human rights. I contribute to teaching an undergraduate counter-terrorism law module, so for the undergraduate law students. And I also lead on a module on our masters in cybercrime and terrorism. I'm a part of the Cyber Threats Research Centre here at Swansea, which includes a number of colleagues with a range of expertise in the areas of terrorism and extremism. Now, the law is such a diverse subject, so I decided to do today's session on an area that really interests me. So it's within my research area of counter-terrorism law and policy. So today I've put together a session on defining terrorism in the United Kingdom. So we're going to look at the legal definition of terrorism in the UK and apply this to some examples. Today we'll start with a name the attacks and name the terrorist attack quiz as an introduction to the subject area. I just need to warn you that this part of the session includes images of and relating to terrorist attacks. Next, I'll show you the legal definition of terrorism in the UK and break this down with you. And then finally, we will look at some real and some hypothetical examples and analyse them using the UK statutory definition of terrorism. At this stage, I want you to think about whether they fall within the definition and whether they should fall within the definition. And at the end of the video, I'll just provide some links to some further resources if you're interested in this area. So there will be 6 questions in this section. The way it works is I'm going to turn my video off and talk through the slides. So I'll show you an image of or relating to a terrorist attack, and I want you to name the attack. I'll show you the image and then pause the video, pause for about 4 seconds before revealing the answer. If you need longer than 4 seconds, then please pause the video. So here's picture 1. So picture 1 is the attack of 9/11. So a total of 19 hijackers took control of 4 commercial aircraft, and they flew 2 of them into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The 3rd crashed into the Pentagon, and the 4th into Pennsylvania, thought to be en route to Capitol Hill or the White House. Besides the 19 hijackers, a total of 29,074 people were killed. Another 24 are missing, presumed dead. The victims came from more than 90 different countries. Following the 9/11 attacks, states around the world enacted a number of terrorism offences. So following this incident, we see a proliferation of terrorism offences and special powers relating to counter-terrorism globally. Okay, picture 2. So the answer here is the Christchurch attack. On March the 15th, the 28-year-old Australian man opened fire in 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, killing 51 people and injuring dozens more. He live streamed the attacks, which was then watched many thousands of times. Brenton Tarrant pleaded guilty to 51 charges of murder, attempted murder of another 40 people, and 1 terrorism charge in March this year. He's currently awaiting sentencing. Picture 3. The answer here is the Manchester Arena attack. On the 22nd of May 2017, a homemade bomb packed with nuts and bolts was detonated as people were leaving Manchester Arena following an Ariana Grande concert. 23 people were killed, including the attacker Salman Abedi, and 250 were injured. Police now believe that Abedi had largely acted alone, but that others had been aware of his plans. It is believed that he learned how to make the bomb from YouTube videos. Picture 4. The answer here is the Westminster Bridge terror attack. On the afternoon of Wednesday, 22nd of March, 52-year-old British-born Khalid Masood drove an SUV hired in Birmingham a few days earlier into pedestrians who were crossing Westminster Bridge, London. 3 were killed at the time and 32 were admitted to hospital, where 1 died later and several others were treated for life-changing injuries. Masood then took 2 carving knives out of the vehicle and fatally stabbed a police officer where he was on duty outside the Houses of Parliament. Masood was shot by armed police and died of his injuries. The entire incident lasted around 90 seconds. Picture 5. The answer here is the Finsbury Park mosque attack. On the 19th of June 2017, at 15 minutes past midnight, a group of Muslims had just finished nighttime prayers held in the month of Ramadan when they came across a man who had collapsed. Whilst they were offering first aid, they were rammed by a hire van. 10 were injured and the collapsed man died at the scene. Darren Osborne from Cardiff was charged with murder and attempted murder. Witnesses reported that after the attack, he said, "I want to kill all Muslims. I did my bit and you deserve it." After his trial, when sentencing Osborne, the judge said that he had become rapidly radicalised over the internet, encountering and consuming material put out from those determined to spread hatred of Muslims on the basis of their religion in the weeks prior to the attack. And this is the last picture, picture 6. The answer here is the Woolwich attack. So Lee Rigby was a member of the British Army, and one day whilst off duty, he was walking in Woolwich when 2 men ran him down with a car and then used knives and a cleaver to stab and hack him to death. They remained at the scene until police arrived and told passers-by that they had killed a British soldier to avenge the killing of Muslims by the British Armed Forces. In December 2013, both were convicted of Rigby's murder. These examples are undisputably recognised as acts of terrorism. However, to define the term terrorism has been a controversial topic, and many countries and international bodies such as the UN have long grappled with how terrorism should be defined. Given the severity of the terrorist threat, there is widespread agreement that there should be special powers available for counter-terrorism. In UK law, there are such special powers. These include broader powers of stop and search, broader powers of arrest. The maximum period of pre-charge detention is longer, so terrorist suspects can be held for up to 14 days. That's 10 days longer than would otherwise be the case. There are also different rules for questioning terrorist suspects. They have a lower level of protection. So defining terrorism is important. So we need a legal concept of terrorism to identify the scope of these powers. this tells us when these special powers can apply. In the UK, the definition of terrorism is set out in legislation. It can be found in Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000. There are 5 key parts to the definition, which are currently on the screen. What I'm going to do is show you 3 more examples. And then I'm going to go through the legal definition of terrorism. Once we've been through the definition of terrorism, I'm going to ask you to apply it and analyse the definition using these examples. I want you to, 1, decide whether you think the example falls within the definition, and 2, whether you think it should fall within the definition. You may want to take a picture of the examples as I flick through them now, because we're going to go through the definition. You may want to think about them as we're talking about the definition, but I will show you them again at the end when I go through the answers. So the first example is Somali pirates who hijacked the Sirius Star. The second example is Nelson Mandela. And the third example is a university lecturer strike. So here is the UK's definition of terrorism. So this is the section from the legislation, the Terrorism Act 2000. So it seems quite long, so we're going to break it down. So there's 5 key parts to the definition. Within section 1 of the Terrorism Act, there's 4 listed. So the definition can be broken down into 5 key requirements altogether. Note that the 5th was added later in case law. So we're going to go through each one in turn. So first of all, we're going to look at the means. And with this, we'll look at the fault requirement. The fault requirement was added into the definition in a later case. So the law in England and Wales comes from legislation and case law. So the fault requirement relates to this first requirement of terrorist means. So this part of the definition is in bold on the screen. So section 1 lists 5 types of action that constitute terrorist means. So you'll see these in subsection 2. So the types of action are serious violence against a person, serious damage to property, action that endangers a person's life other than that of the person committing the action, creates a serious risk to the health or safety of the public or a section of the public, or is designed seriously to interfere with or seriously to disrupt an electronic system. And please note in the first paragraph, so the very first line, that it includes the use or threat of action. So the terrorist means could be the threat of serious violence against the person, as well as actual serious violence against the person. Now, what we mean by the fault requirement is that the person must have intended these acts to occur, so must intend the effect. So the person must intend serious violence against a person. So that's the first requirement, and the 5th, means and fault. The second requirement is the target. So terrorist acts are not just directed at the people who suffer serious violence. Terrorist acts are also directed at a wider audience. They seek to generate terror in the wider population. And this is what section 1(1)(b) seeks to capture. as highlighted on the screen. So this is the target. So the use or threat is designed to influence the government or an international governmental organisation, or to intimidate the public or a section of the public. So note there's two elements to it. So one, the action or the threat of action, the terrorist means, must be designed to influence the government or international governmental organisation, or the action or threat of action is designed to intimidate the public or a section of the public. So this is what the legislation means by the target, the terrorist target. And this is supposed to capture the fact that terrorist acts are directed at a wider audience. The third requirement in the legislation is the motive. So this is in section 11C in bold on the screen. So the use or threat is made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. So there are 4 key terrorist motives according to the legislation. So terrorist acts are motivated by 1, a political cause, 2, a religious cause, 3, a racial cause, or 4th, an ideological cause. So that's what we mean in the UK definition of the requirement of motive. It must be to advance a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. Now, the 4th requirement relates to the jurisdiction. So note then that the UK definition covers action against any foreign government. So it doesn't just include action against the UK government, it covers action against any foreign government. And this is regardless of how oppressive or undemocratic that foreign government may be. So this includes liberation movements. So there we have the key requirements: means, target, motive, jurisdiction, and fault. What I want you to do now is we're going to go back to the examples one by one. For each example, I want you to decide whether this falls within the definition. So to do that, read the example and then think whether it meets those 5 key requirements. Is there a terrorist means, target, a terrorist motive, jurisdiction, and is there the fault element? So because I'd obviously rather be doing this session with you all in person, usually in person, we'd have some discussion. So what I'll do is I'll get the example up, I'll pause for a couple of seconds again, so you can pause your video to have a go. 1, at deciding whether the example falls within the definition. And 2, just have a think about whether you think it should. So I'll just pause the video for a couple of, I'll pause the image on the screen with the example for a couple of seconds, and then I'll go through possible answers. So there's 3 examples. So the first one we have is the Somali pirates. So the Sirius Star is an oil tanker that was hijacked in November 2008. It was carrying 2 million barrels of oil worth over £100 million. The hijackers were paid a £3 million ransom in January 2009 and freed the tanker. On their way back to Somalia, their boat was capsized by rough seas. 3 of the pirates survived, but lost their ransom money as they swam to shore. The other 5 pirates drowned. 1 was subsequently washed ashore with £153,000 $100,000 in his pocket. So, do we think this falls within the UK's definition of terrorism? Okay, well, if we go back to the key requirements, in terms of the means, it seems that by hijacking the tanker with the oil, this could constitute a threat of serious damage to property. It could also include threat of serious violence against a person, depending who was on the tanker that was hijacked. It would seem, because they asked for ransom money, that they had the intention, so that would satisfy the fault element. So it seems that there's terrorist means and the fault. So means and fault requirement are satisfied. Jurisdiction, we know that the UK's definition applies to any actions against any foreign government, so that is likely to be satisfied. However, the issue here is whether this satisfies the requirements of motive and target. So if we think back to the target, so the use or threat is designed to influence the government or an international government organisation, or to intimidate the public or a section of the public. It could be argued that a threat to damage to property by hijacking the oil could be designed to influence the government because they wanted ransom money. However, this first example is unlikely to meet the motive requirement. So remember, the motive requirement is that the use or threat of action is made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. If we go back, it seems to be that the hijackers just wanted the ransom money. And as soon as they received the ransom money, they freed the tanker. So it's unlikely that this falls within the UK's legal definition of terrorism. I suppose what you want to consider is whether you think it should. So do you think the definition is sufficient? Do you think that this type of circumstance should fall within the UK's definition of terrorism? Now, our second example is Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was an anti-apartheid activist. In the early 1960s, he coordinated sabotage campaigns against government and military targets to pave the way for a possible guerrilla war. He was imprisoned in 1962 and served 27 years. 4 years after his release, he was elected president. So, do we think that this falls within the UK's definition of terrorism? Do you think that it should fall within the UK's definition of terrorism? Okay, so again, we need to go through each of the requirements. Now, the movement that Mandela led is likely to meet the means requirement, threat of serious damage to property, and having the intention to do so. It's also likely to meet the target requirement, as that threat of action or use of action was designed to influence the government. It's also likely to meet the motive requirement, as it seems that he had a political cause. He was using the threat or use of action to advance his political cause. In terms of jurisdiction, remember that the UK's definition of terrorism applies against actions against any foreign government, no matter how oppressive they are. So liberation movements fall within the UK's definition of terrorism. So it's likely that Nelson Mandela would have fallen within the UK's legal definition of terrorism set out in Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000. So what I would ask you now is to just think whether you think that he should. So this has led people to question whether there should be exceptions in the definition of terrorism, whether it should include actions against a foreign government. And this should lead to bigger questions, and hopefully you can see how defining terrorism is controversial. It's been famously said how one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And this is why international organisations in particular grapple with defining terrorism. Now, our third and final example is a university lecturer strike. So this is hypothetical. The trade union for university lecturers announces a strike. During the strike, a group of lecturers form a picket line outside the university entrance. They decide to physically restrain any lecturer who tries to cross the picket line using whatever force is necessary. Do you think this falls within the UK's definition of terrorism? Do you think that it should? Okay, let's go through these requirements again. So note, in terms of means, the facts say that the lecturers had decided to physically restrain any lecturer who tried to cross the picket line. So if it's seen that this constitutes serious violence, then this would satisfy the means requirement. So I suppose it depends on the force used to physically restrain other individuals crossing the picket line. So the means requirement could be satisfied. Use of serious violence against a person. It would seem from the facts as well that the fault requirement is met, as it seems that this was intentional, as this is what they had decided to do. Jurisdiction in this one is more straightforward because it's within the UK. What is more tricky here is whether the target and the motive requirements are met. The key issue being is that you are not told the purpose of the protest. So remember that the protest needs to be done in a way that is to influence the government, so with the view of influencing the government or intimidate the public. I would hope university lecturers are not trying to intimidate the public, but it could be that they're protesting for a cause that means it's designed to influence the government. If it is, this is likely to satisfy the motive requirement, as the action would be taken to advance a political cause. But there isn't a clear-cut answer here because it's not clear. You're not told why the universities are protesting. Now, there often are not definitive answers in law, and that's what makes it interesting. So there are always two sides to an argument, and this is a lot of what learning the law is. So you'll learn the legal rules, but you'll also learn how to research rules, how to advance arguments, and how to counter arguments. So I just want to thank you for listening. This is an area that really interests me, so I hope that you found it interesting. What I have on the next slide is just some resources if you want to look into it further. I just think learning the law, there's so many opportunities and there's such a diverse range of subjects, and a lot of it is tackling really difficult issues and questions, and that's what makes it interesting and exciting. So if you are interested in this subject area and would like to explore some more resources, there's some links that you could note down on the screen, The first of which is to the Cyber Threats Research Centre at Swansea University, if you want to have a look what work people are doing. There's a link there to 2 different podcasts, one Tech Against Terrorism and the second a Talking Terror podcast. So they're particular episodes, but there are more episodes there if that interests you. And there are also 2 short pieces there in the conversation. So the conversation is an online media resource. It's where academics write short pieces on current and topical issues. So even if you don't want to look about terrorism or the law or counterterrorism further, the conversation is a great resource for most subject areas. That's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.